In the time before time, when the sun still learned how to crawl across the skies of the Black Land, the Nile was a vein of fire running through a body of warring tribes. The land we now call Egypt was not yet Egypt. It was a patchwork of bitter chieftains and jealous river kings, each clinging to their piece of clay and reed, dreaming of something greater, fearing something worse. And in the highlands of the south, in the red desert winds of Thynis, a boy was born who would wear 2 crowns and unify the world he knew. His name was Narmer. He was not born into peace. His childhood was carved in stone and dust, sharpened on blades and tempered by the songs of war. The upper kingdom, stretching along the narrow cradle of the Nile, was a place of lean muscles and hard choices. Life there was survival, of lions and rivals, of famine and flood. But among the men of Thynis, Narmer stood out early, not because he was stronger or louder, but because he watched. He watched everything, the flocks, the fighters, the priests in their white linen circles. His eyes, wide and black like obsidian stones, absorbed more than they revealed. It is said that before Narmer could walk, the high priest of Horus had a vision. A falcon flying from the cliffs of the south, landing upon the green reeds of the north, its talons dripping in both lotus and papyrus. The priest proclaimed that one day, a king would rise who would wear both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of the Delta. Most dismissed it as a poetic tale to soothe the gods and frighten enemies. But Narmer's mother whispered that story to him at night, long after the fires went out, her voice low and distant, as if she feared the prophecy would hear her speak it. He grew into the prophecy, not by magic but by purpose. Narmer trained under warriors who had never known peace, men who had killed more times than they had spoken to their own children. He learned to wield the mace with both hands, to balance on boats under the moon, to read the clouds, to cut through armor and through lies. But more than that, he learned the art of rule, the ancient web of respect and dread that made men kneel. As a young prince, Narmer traveled the breadth of Upper Egypt. From Elephantine to Abydos, he walked the dusty temple courts, listened to traders with tongues from far Nubia, and debated law with priests whose minds were older than their faces. He was building something inside himself first and then outside. The north was chaos. Lower Egypt, with its sprawling deltas and tangled marshlands, was rich in fish, in grain, in people. But it was poor in unity. Dozens of petty kings ruled from their riverbanks, constantly at war or alliance, depending on who married whose daughter. They mistrusted the southerners, whom they called hawks, hunters, sharp and cruel. The north called itself the land of the bee, and the south the land of the reed. And in this division centuries had passed, filled with blood and mischances. Narmer watched, and he waited. His moment came when the Delta kings began to fight among themselves more fiercely than usual. One of them, a self-declared pharaoh named Wash, sent word to Thynis demanding tribute. Narmer responded not with gold, but with silence. In that silence, war began. It was not swift. Narmer led his warriors through narrow wadis and flooded fields. They came not like thunder but like fog, silent, precise, devastating. Each town fell not to massacre, but to transformation. Narmer replaced the local lords with men loyal to Thynis. He spared the temples, honored the local gods, and carried images of Horus and Seth side by side. He was not just conquering. He was seducing a kingdom into belief. The final battle came at the bend of the Nile near a city the northerners called Pi. There Wash and his army made their stand, bolstered by mercenaries from Canaan and dark-skinned warriors from the western sands. It was a clash of suns. The war drums beat like heartbeats, the air thick with incense, blood, and prophecy. Narmer struck like a hawk. His soldiers moved with terrifying discipline, their shields painted with the twin symbols of Upper Egypt, the lotus and the falcon. In the heart of the battlefield, amid smoke and cries, Narmer himself found Washington. The two clashed, not just men but gods, not just warriors but worlds. Narmer triumphed, and from that moment Egypt became one. The palette was carved shortly after. A slab of siltstone, tall as a man's torso, engraved with a story in eternal lines. One side showed Narmer smiting a foe, crowned in the white of the south, standing as the embodiment of Horus. The other showed him wearing the red crown of the north, walking in procession past rows of decapitated enemies. Beneath his feet, two monstrous creatures with entwined necks, the unity of the two lands, writ in stone. Narmer declared himself pharaoh not just of the south, but of all Egypt. He did not do it with trumpets or temples, but with balance. He wore both crowns, the Hedjet and the Dishret, merged into one double crown called the Skent. He married a woman from the Delta, Neithhotep, daughter of a rival turned ally, a priestess of the goddess of war and wisdom. Their union was not born of love but of necessity. And yet, in time, something deeper bloomed. Neithhotep was no idle ornament. She brought with her not only a bloodline but a mind sharp as obsidian. She advised Narmer in private councils, introduced rituals to blend the gods of north and south, and taught the court to see unity not as submission, but as fusion. Where Narmer commanded swords, she commanded symbols. She rebuilt temples, rewrote liturgies, and reshaped identity. Together they founded Memphis, on a bluff of land where the upper Nile narrowed into the branches of the delta. They built a capital, a city of reeds and mud brick, shrines and statues. Memphis was neither north nor south, but between. It was Narmer's answer to division, a place where no one had to kneel too far. The first years of rule were tense. Narmer walked a razor's edge, holding back resentment from northern nobles and suspicion from southern warriors. He created new titles to reward loyalty, dispatched tax collectors who answered only to him, and sent artists to paint his face in every city, often with Horus perched on his shoulder. He was crafting an image, not a man but a myth. He traveled constantly. From temple to temple, he prayed to both Horus and Seth, praising both sky and storm. In his hands, duality became doctrine. He was the ruler of two lands, but also the bridge between them. His speeches invoked ancestors from both ends of the Nile. His decrees were issued in pictographs understandable to both. He even reformed the calendar, tying festivals of the north to observances of the south, creating a rhythm of the kingdom that beat as one heart. And yet, Narmer knew unity was fragile. In the whispers of the court, in the eyes of old men in the delta, he saw doubt. In the silence of the temples, he heard prayers for the old ways. The scars of war had not yet healed, and beneath the surface, the land still remembered the line that once divided it. Narmer feared that without a deeper bond, the two lands would drift again. So he turned to permanence. He commanded the building of great halls in Memphis and new roads along the Nile. He instituted a census, counting people not as subjects but as members of a whole. And he commissioned more palettes, more carvings, more depictions of himself as a unifier, a warrior, a god. One of the most sacred carvings showed him standing between two deities, Horus and Seth, his hands raised in peace. It was said that in his presence, the gods themselves did not argue. And perhaps for a moment in time that was true. Neithhotep bore him a son, and the child was named Hora-Ha, the fighting Horus. It was a name of legacy, a name that proclaimed continuation. The bloodline had begun. The two lands had a future. On the day of Hora-Ha's naming, Narmer stood at the edge of the Nile, watching the water swallow the last light of the sun. Behind him, Memphis rose like a promise. Before him, the river flowed northward into the delta, smooth and wide, carrying with it the hopes of a civilization newly born. But Narmer's eyes were elsewhere, downriver, toward the marshes, where peace still had not fully bloomed. The war had ended, the crowns had united, but the soul of Egypt was still forming. And so ended the first chapter of the two lands, not with a final strike, but with a beginning. Time, even in its earliest hours, was a patient teacher. It had taught Narmer that unification was not an event, but a process. A slow, grinding reshaping of minds, beliefs, and bloodlines. In the early years after the war, he had carved his authority with blade and crown. But as the dust settled and temples began to echo with songs of peace, he found himself grappling with something more elusive: harmony. The two lands were now one in name, but their hearts beat in separate rhythms. In the south, warriors still draped in leopard skins whispered that Narmer had bent the knee too far to northern ways. In the north, priests of the papyrus groves murmured that their gods had been swallowed by the hawk of Thynis. Whispers became rituals, and rituals became silence. In silence, division brewed. Narmer did not retreat. He doubled his efforts, reforming grain distribution, consolidating provincial governors, and issuing edicts that made it illegal to sacrifice without royal approval. He sent emissaries to Nubia, to Byblos, to the Red Sea, seeking trade routes and foreign alliances. His ambition was not merely Egyptian. He saw his unified kingdom as the foundation of a broader world order. But not all challenges came from outside. Within his own court, loyalties wavered. The noble families of the Delta, once pacified by promises and marriages, began to pull strings behind the walls of Memphis. Murmurs of a true northern heir arose, distant cousins of Neithhotep claiming ancestral rights. Even among Narmer's own generals, the glint of envy began to reflect off polished bronze. Yet through it all, Neithhotep remained his anchor. No longer just a political bride, she had grown into the true counterpart of a pharaoh. While Narmer walked among soldiers and scribes, she walked the sacred halls of temples, forging alliances with high priests, sponsoring oracles, and commissioning artwork that blended southern and northern symbology. In the temple of Neith at Sais, she had her likeness carved beside the goddess herself, an act both reverent and revolutionary. Their son, Hor-Aha, grew beneath the gaze of gods and expectations. From an early age, he trained not just in war, but in ritual, astronomy, law, and language. Narmer was molding not just an heir, but a symbol, a pharaoh who would be born into unity, not conquest. Aha bore the weight of that legacy silently, his young eyes mirroring the same obsidian depth his father once carried. But peace, as always, was temporary. To the south, the tribes of Nubia grew restless. They had tolerated trade with Egypt for generations, exchanging gold, ivory, and slaves for grain and linen. But with Narmer's expanding influence and construction of military outposts along the border, the old lords of the cataracts rebelled. Led by a fierce war chief named Kenet, they descended upon Egypt's southern provinces with burning speed. Narmer, now well into his 50s, did not hesitate. Against the advice of his generals and priests, he donned his armor once more and led his army into the blazing desert winds. His arrival at the southern frontier was heralded not by ceremony, but by the sudden retreat of his enemies. For even in age, Narmer's name still carried the weight of inevitability. The campaign was brutal. The Nubians were fierce and agile, masters of terrain and silence. Narmer's forces suffered heavy losses as they pushed through narrow canyons and thorn-choked oases. But through sheer discipline and relentless strategy, he prevailed. Kenet was captured, not killed, and brought before the pharaoh in chains. In an act that stunned both his allies and enemies, Narmer released him. "You fought for your land," he said, in a dialect few expected him to know. "Now fight for mine." Kenet became a general in Narmer's southern legions, a symbol of inclusion and control. It was not compassion that drove Narmer, but calculation. He knew that domination alone would break the nation he built. It needed cohesion, rooted in mutual respect and shared destiny. Yet the campaign left him wounded, not gravely, but enough to change his pace. A gash across his thigh, poorly healed in the desert, made it painful to walk for long. He returned to Memphis limping but unbowed, greeted by Neithhotep with quiet hands and unspoken worry. In the following years, Narmer became more withdrawn. He spent hours in the Great Hall of Memphis, staring at maps, scrolls, and stars. He began construction of what would later be known as the Royal House of Records, an archive of law, myth, agriculture, astronomy, and divine rulings. He invited scholars from all corners of Egypt to contribute, effectively planting the seed of what future generations would call the library of the two lands. He also initiated a great census, documenting every citizen, every field, every offering to the gods. Not for taxation alone, but to measure his people's growth, their needs, their fears. It was a ruler's attempt to understand his nation not just as territory, but as pulse and breath. In one of his final great proclamations, Narmer declared that all temples, north and south, must bear the symbol of the unification, the entwined lotus and papyrus, on their gates. He sent stonemasons and artists to oversee compliance. In response, a new style of art emerged, one that blended the rigid lines of Upper Egyptian formality with the fluid curves of Delta expression. The soul of Egypt was no longer split. It was becoming something new. Then, Neithhotep fell ill. It began subtly: fatigue, tremors, sleeplessness. The healers tried herbs, incantations, bloodletting, offerings. Nothing worked. Narmer stayed by her side, his stern silence betraying cracks of helplessness. She faded slowly, her spirit seeming to drift before her body did. On the night of her passing, the Nile was unusually still, as if the river itself mourned. Her funeral was unlike any before. Held at the temple of Neith she had built, it was attended by every governor, priest, and dignitary from both ends of the land. The ceremony was led by Hora-Ha, his voice steady as he chanted verses of crossing and rebirth. Narmer, clothed in pure white linen, walked alone behind her golden sarcophagus, his head bare, his gaze lost in the far horizon. They buried her with royal rites, but also with the symbols of both lands. Upon her chest was placed a dual amulet, a falcon and a serpent intertwined. In that symbol, Narmer saw not death, but completion. After her passing, Narmer changed. He no longer toured the provinces. He no longer spoke in court with the same fire. His orders came through intermediaries, precise but cold. He spent his days in the Hall of Records, reading, writing, carving. He began composing hymns not to the gods but to the nation itself. He wrote of the Nile as a mother, of the desert as a guardian, of the two lands as lovers. In his solitude he designed his own tomb. Not as a pyramid, not yet. The knowledge of such structures would bloom generations later. But it was vast, complex, layered with chambers and passages. In one of the central halls, he ordered a massive carving of the Narmer palette, this time etched into living rock with new inscriptions. Below his smiting pose, he added a single line. He struck, not to conquer, but to unify. Near the end of his life, Narmer summoned Hora-Ha. He handed him a scroll sealed in wax, marked with the crest of the two lands. "Rule as you were born," he said, voice thin. "Not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. Our kingdom is not a blade. It is a bridge." Then, on a day when the Nile flooded higher than it had in decades, Narmer passed. The priests said the gods wept. The scribes said the land held its breath. The people lit fires along the riverbanks, casting lotus flowers into the waters. Hora-Ha, now pharaoh, led the mourning but also the promise. In his father's name, he pledged to continue the great work, not of conquest but of consolidation. And Narmer's legacy endured. The double crown became the eternal symbol of Egyptian kingship. The capital at Memphis grew into one of the world's greatest cities. The laws he drafted, the temples he raised, the vision he carved into stone, these became the spine of Egyptian civilization. His name was etched not only in stone, but in rhythm, ritual, and river. Centuries later, when scribes debated who was the first pharaoh, who began it all, they did not argue. They spoke his name with reverence. Narmer. He was the falcon of the south, the serpent of the north, the father of the two lands. And though he returned to dust, his dream flowed on. In every bend of the Nile,